There are slides that have to be changed. But I don't have that many slides anyway. It's just to set a little bit of discussion. The small suspect that you guys don't already know this all. But okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Skillsshare on practicing hacker ethics. My name is Stefania. I'm an Italian living in the Netherlands. And just to give you a sense of where I come from studying and practicing media activism. I actually studied from radio, then life, job opportunities, somehow cornered my work, activism and research into more digital stuff. And in a way or another, I spent quite some time with hackers. And the idea of this workshop actually stems from this type of interaction, which I find extremely interesting, although probably a little gloomy sometimes. But especially in the post-Snowden time that we are living in, I think it's very important that also people who work with movements, communities, and in the field of media activism reflect a little bit on what are the dangers that technology and tools bring along. So in a way, the observation that prompted the idea and then the proposal for this Skillshare was to see that media activism, both activists, dictionaries, and scholars do not talk enough with, do not engage sufficiently with people who work on, for example, computer cultures. So we do not talk enough with each other, and the result is that probably we are missing bits here and there. Now the focus is on what we are missing, right? I'm sure they're also missing a lot from not interacting with us, but we have to start from somewhere. And what I would like to sort of inform the conversation today is this quote. This was collected during my PhD, my field work. This was one of the media developers from the early days. And when I asked him, okay, what prompted you to work on such a project? He said the following. It was an observation of seeing that the so-called grassroots social movements needed new networks of communication that could not only work as a platform to project discourses and practices to the wider world, but also that the ways these networks were created, run, and developed mirrored as much as possible the direct, participatory, collective, and autonomous nature of the emerging social movements themselves. So the idea is to try to connect the values we stand for, the word as we would like it to be, with the technologies we use. So taking a little bit of a critical approach to the technology we use, which I think is particularly important as the technology we rely upon for interpersonal communication, but also for activism these days, are to a large extent proprietary. And if this was not the case with a lot of the radio, for example, that we were and are doing today, Facebook, Twitter, Google, they're all platforms that might be useful, but they come with some problems. So that's what I would like to reflect upon with you. So the goal of today is to deconstruct, reflect on our views, but also our relationship with technology, taking as a point of departure hacker ethics. So I'm going to take a little bit of a soup approach to hacker ethics. Sort of, I created my own list, but of values that I think are useful, that we can learn from hackers that are useful to reflect on our work. And then possibly with group work, together shape up, develop a critical approach to technology that we can apply to our media activism practices, but I will also daily use as individuals in the world. And then I added that over lunch. Also, possibly, if people are interested, to our research practices. I'm an academic. I engage with social movements, but I'm very well aware that by studying them, to some extent, I expose them to surveillance, for example. So what can we learn from hacker ethics? Principles like do not harm when we go into the field. So this is also an option. I have some suggestions that come from all my own work. So that's the part for the application part is for our group work, if we want to do that. There are two parts. a list as I see it. A first longer part, which is looking into the ethics of technology. I'm going to have this very short presentation that summarizes a little bit what I'm talking about. And then group work. And then I have reserved for the end just a list of an overview of technologies of resistance. It's a little bit of an optimistic label in the sense that most of these are developed by companies. Some of these are community projects, grassroots projects, but the ones that are listed there are open source list. And they represent alternatives to Facebook, Google, WhatsApp, and so on and so forth. So just a sort of rolling list, because it's continuous development, that offers some food for thought and to change our daily practices. I've done it with my research group. It took ages. But we are now completely and proudly open source and encrypted. Sort of. We still use university mail, which is Microsoft, but that's another story. Our mailing list is somewhere else. Okay, so this is what the plan for today. So just now, as to set some basics for our conversation, I've done my PhD spending quite some time with what I call radical tech collectives. One of them, for example, is RiseUp, although I was actually not directly studying RiseUp. But this is probably the most famous North American example. It's closer to the audience here, probably. And these collectives are concerned with creating and shaping digital technology infrastructure. The focus today is really on the infrastructure, not on the content that is exchanged in the wires, to facilitate communication networking for social change activists. And there are two examples. RiseUp is one, Autistic Inventati is the other one, which is the RiseUp counterpart for Europe. It's based in Italy, but it's animated by many other activists around Europe, and not only. There are many, many more, of course. These are probably the biggest in terms of communities and groups they serve. And just to clarify a little bit, then we have hacking, which to some extent hackers intersect the groups that I mentioned, although maybe not every one of the radical techies will define himself or herself as a hacker. But hacking originally was, interesting, apolitical. So when it started around the MIT and that computer culture of the 70s, it actually literally referred to playful tinkering with, messing up with hardware and software to improve it, for making things better. And the emphasis was really on the machine, software and hardware hacking. But later on, some groups became more politicized. One of them is the cult of the dead cow, which is now called Activism. And yeah, okay, so the cult of the dead cow, I think it was actually founded by a Canadian. So that's why I included the example there, but I think it was based in Seattle. And it was a group that was active probably in the 90s, if I remember correctly. And that, adopted, so they were skilled programmers, but they also tried to bring their thinking with technology over to society and engage in a societal critique. The name itself is quite interesting. You can still find them online. But what is interesting, another reason why I included them here, is that they belong to a sort of old school generation of hackers, if you want, although it's a bit of a random definition. These people would never harm a machine. So harm the machine. So the idea is that, okay, we tinker, we mess up with it, but we do not interrupt communication. On the other hand, well, then of course you have the classical distinction between black and white hackers, black hackers being the mean ones who steal your credit card information. White hats are kind of more nicer version. Recently in the Netherlands, the government implemented a piece of legislation, ethical hacking, which is basically hackers at the service of the state, for good or for bad, a little creepy, area. So it is a group that, of course, and a number of, let's say, approaches and attitudes to technology and society is grown under increasing attention by authorities, also for cooptation, and private companies, of course, which are always at the front for the cooptation of good ideas and smart people. And then you have more recent evolution, if you want, of hacking, which some people call hacktivism, that originated in the 90s. When some hackers decided that it was about time to engage in political activism as well. The first instances the first recorded instances, if you want, a group of French and Italian activists, hackers actually, called for the first net strike against the French government websites in, I think it was 1992 or 1995. And it was in protest against the fact that the French government was engaging in nuclear experiments in Mururoa, an island somewhere in Polynesia. And their idea was that, well, in times of nomadic power, it doesn't make much sense to protest on the square, but we better take our protest into the web and block the websites. So this was first, they call it net strike, but it was literally what will be called today distributed denial of service attack. So they just tried to take down temporarily a website, a series of websites of the French government, succeeding. And it was later theorized by other groups. So there are also books that discuss this. I have plenty of literature if you're curious. But the idea of the activism is politically motivated use of technical expertise. Fixing society through software, or if you want, leveraging the ontological and infrastructural properties of the web for political reasons. Probably the most famous, though a little controversial example, is Anonymous. And I leave it at that because it's not a lecture on who is what, but it's just to get a little bit of the record straight on what we're talking about. So what sort of message do these people have for us? But first of all, it's interesting to think that the idea of hacker ethics comes from people that were not politically minded. But I just leave it at that. So they're kind of principles that are not developed by activists, but have some kind of activist seeds in them. But then the other very important message is that cyberspace, if you want to use that term. I still use it because I do a lot of work on cybersecurity policy making as part of my activism. And that's the term that state uses. So I also use it, although technically it's a little incorrect probably. But it's a very military term. So cyberspace is an object of contention. Infrastructure is not neutral. So this is the bottom line message. Whatever we use, it was designed, developed, and sold or provided to us with certain values in mind. Capitalist values, profit, most likely. Repression as well, why not? I mean, there are some instances of that as well. Or profit that then results in repression and surveillance, Facebook being the most important example. Sorry, I'm a little negative when it comes to these things, but I think there's reason for that. So hackers, radical tech collectives embody moral norms and alternative narratives of cyberspace, and that's what I would like to engage with in order to rethink a little bit our practices. And in order to do that, I've back a while ago classified the ethics of organizing as it connects to the ethics of technology. So a sort of internal code of these groups, and I'm talking about radical tech collectives more than hackers here, so politically minded groups that put their skills at the service of social movements, progressive social movements. So the way they organize, which is on the left of the screen, and then the tech code, so the values that inform the technology that or the infrastructure that these people developed. One little sad part of the story is that most of these people are actually men, and they're actually white, and generally well-educated, or at least they had access. Not necessarily educated as in university education, doesn't have to be formal education, but simply they don't come from deprived backgrounds, which is a bit of a problem. Nonetheless, there's still something that we can learn from these people. So it is a rough classification, and what I wanted to show here is that literally that, I don't really see it very well, but that the way is the goal. So the way things are done is a goal in itself. So not only technology that they developed has to be participatory, nice, and all of that, but also the way that this is done has to mirror these values. And then next step down the line also the activism that we stand for. The way we engage in activism has to be in line with the values that we sort of support and the vision of the world as we would like it to be. So as I said, it's a bit of rough classification. We can quickly go over it. First principle, I mean, as you can see, they mirror each other, the two sides. Equality, so no hierarchies, at least in theory. direct democracies, consensus. Then something I very much like and I tend to implement also when I do research with my team, dictatorship of action. Do you want to do something? Take responsibility for it, go and do it. This is possible because people share political values a priori. So even before joining the group, these are mostly like affinity groups. So people would trust each other at the onset. So of course, the dictatorship of action is only possible when, first of all, people are extremely busy trying to create and support infrastructure, make it work. But also like servers, for example, for movements. But also it's possible when people trust each other and share a certain set of values. So it's not possible if you have in mind something controversial, like a collaboration with a potential enemy, stuff like that. Then participation, first-person engagement and individual responsibility. First-person engagement is really like the hands-on playing, demystifying technology, which can be at different levels, doesn't necessarily have to be at a programmer, super skilled level. It can also be much more simple. I mean, right now, for example, there's a workshop that actually tries to do exactly that with building a transmitter. So that's what I'm referring to. Communitarianism, shared ownership, and collective improvement. And then autonomy, both in terms of so autonomy of the activities, so hands-on, do-it-yourself approach in building infrastructure, but also self-organization and self-determination, and autonomy of the individual within the group. And then the way is the goal, as I mentioned. And then tech code, where equality, so you have things like the notion of the e-commons, so the idea that all, like net neutrality, the principle by which all bits are created equal, so they should not be discriminated in the transmission by providers. Autonomy, self-determination, built-in privacy, no state interference, nuisance campaign. Well, this belongs to some other realm, but the idea is that you have to be in control of your data, for example, because the data belong to you, but also you might build infrastructure which are distributed, where the data is then distributed in a trusted network as opposed to centralized in the hands of a company that might then mess up with it or sell it. Openness, as in accessibility, malleability, transparency of standards and architecture, knowledge sharing, collective improvement again. And then freedoms of access, dissent, expression, freedom of sharing, freedom of hacking, which is engaging directly with technology, which then has to be accessible. So these are, this is my sort of redux version of hacker ethics, which puts together some hacker elements, but also some more kind of politically radical tech-informed values. So sharing and open collaboration, openness and transparency, decentralization and self-determination, free access and hands-on, world improvement, and do not harm. I think that none of this needs to be explained. Probably some need to be contextualized a little bit. World improvement refers to something that has been enshrined in a very simple sentence: leave things better than, I forgot it, wait, because I have to write it down. Leave things as you found them or better, which also, if you think about our relationship with the community, it's kind of an important principle, and not, unfortunately, one that is always respected, and not necessarily for our fault, but. So that would be world improvement. Do not harm is something similar. Do not harm, for example, the community. I mean, this refers mostly to the machine, at least in the way it was originally thought. But if you apply it to the work of activists, it's pretty important. For example, what does it mean to use, again, Facebook for activism? Well, it simply means, among other things, well, to reach people where they are, fair enough, but also to really give to law enforcement a very nice, really well, developed social graph of whoever is sharing certain ideas, which might be okay if we live in Canada, maybe not, but we can, let's assume at least here it's okay, but in many other places it's not okay. Anyway, who knows what the future holds for us in that respect. So this is just one simple example. When it comes from sharing and open collaboration, one way of seeing it, also understanding openness, is the issue of accessibility. Not only, there's also visually impaired people, for example, or people were impaired in a variety of ways, and we might not be able to use certain platforms. But for example, if you try to use Google Docs from China, good luck with that. You don't. So that's also something that we might want to consider. We don't have to go to a very authoritarian country like China, but we can also look at much of the Middle East, unfortunately, to find several cases of blocked platforms. So this is also something that we have to keep in mind. So my idea now would be to break in groups. And if you like the idea, we are not that many, so we can also create 2 groups. And there's paper there. And try to rethink what I mentioned here. Apply it. So think our media activism practices, our media consumption practices, and if you want, also our research practices in relation to these values. Then we can report back and continue the discussion, if you like the idea. Again, one way of thinking. Oh yeah, there was even a slide summarizing it. One way of thinking about this is probably not to be extremist. I am a little bit of, I study surveillance, so I have my own ideas on that, and I try to be a little clear when it comes to these problems. Although, I mean, I'm an Apple user, I'm not perfect. But it's probably... But one way probably of thinking proactively instead of getting depressed about this is to keep in mind this quote. This was from another activist that I interviewed, who said that do-it-yourself media projects are in the lucky position to define their activities themselves. Therefore, they can be very utopian, very experimental. They don't have the pressure to present an outcome at the end, and they can afford to be radical in their practice and analysis without the need to find consensus with more established organizations. As such, and this is the important part of the message, they might have the function of some utopian guiding stars. The star that provides fixed points of navigation for sailors who use it for orientation without attempting to reach it. So what I mean is that we don't actually have to go home and change completely our practices, or the practice of entire movements. By the way, unfortunately, they're not in the room. The people who were most vocally in support of Facebook the first evening, they're not here, unfortunately. Because that would have been fun. I mean, probably I would also have, maybe changed my mind. I don't know. But so it's really, I mean, there's value in being where people hang out. But maybe then our internal practices can be, informed by these principles. Maybe we can take our mailing list off Google and somewhere else where we don't get advertising, we are tracked down continuously. So, without getting depressed, again, but seeing this as a sort of 5 years plan, given we were discussing that earlier in one of the sessions before lunch. So some sort of ideal perspective for the years to come, given anyway, Snowden is just the beginning, if you ask me. So this will be the question. What can we learn from hacker ethics and radical tech collectives to inform our media consumption, our media activism, and our research on media activism? So if there's someone who also wants to do the part on research, we can have 3 groups, or we can have 2 groups. I don't know, what do you suggest? Or we can just have groups, or we don't have to have groups, we can just discuss all together, which is probably better, given we're not that many, and trying to go through these 3 items, if we like that, yeah. We can also, discuss specific platforms if we want, but you don't have to. The research part? Yeah, if everyone is interested in that, I'm very happy to discuss it. Is everyone a researcher here? Is everyone a researcher? Yeah, that's a good question. No, but we don't, not necessarily in the eyes of academia. Not in this contest, please. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Maybe do we take notes on a big piece of paper, small piece of paper? I take notes.
I wrote my PhD. Is it working? Okay. My PhD dissertation about the history of the ultra-globalization movement in Canada, and as I was setting up interviews, and then storing the information on my computer, which doesn't have any special encryption. I don't think I even had a password on my laptop at that point. I became cognizant of the fact that it could very well be that the communications I was having with the activists I was interviewing was probably being monitored by the state, because it was a year following the G20 protest in Toronto, and I interviewed all of the core people at the heart of that demonstration, who subsequently ended up going to jail for conspiracy against the state. So I thought it was quite likely that my subsequent interviews with them were being monitored, but I was using Google and Gmail to communicate with them. But a lot of them had also Gmail accounts that they were using to communicate with me, so it was never something that entered into our consciousness as something that we should be wary of. And since then, I became a little bit more cognizant of it, but I still continue to use my Gmail account because it is the easiest interface, and it has all of the storage space. So for utilitarian purposes, and maybe this is my problem, you know, and like in talking with you, we're going to set up a mailing list for a working group after lunch, and you suggested RiseUp. I don't know anyone who uses RiseUp anymore. I think it was like a ultra globalization. RiseUp was really big then, and now everybody is on Gmail, like virtually. It's such a hegemonic platform, right? But of course, you do? Okay. I guess I know two people now, and Stefania. But I mean, we are confronted with the hegemony of Google as a platform that everybody uses and is not always very self-critical about it. And of course, I have no proof that the state was surveilling the communication we're having, and I'm not sure whether RiseUp is immune to that kind of thing, but certainly I think you know, we need to be a little bit more self-critical, and I need to be more self-critical about the way I use these tools, and especially researching with activists, anarchists who are definitely being surveilled by the state. It's something I need to be more cognizant of.
You're also being surveilled if they're surveilled, but it's not necessarily a problem because we have certainly more freedom than others. But I don't know, I'm writing random things. There's no specific reasoning behind what I'm writing.
Whoa, okay. One thing is email is a problem. Even RiseUp, they mention on their platform that don't expect privacy using RiseUp. Yeah, don't expect privacy using email with RiseUp. Email is not done for privacy. You have to encrypt your email. So, so yeah, there is the hegemony of platform, but there's the technology with the email technology with a problem. It's funny because about the research, it's just not about accuratix though. It's more like the research board are more aware of these encryption thing, because I'm very I'm sensible on this, and I'm encrypting on my interviews and stuff like this, and I've been for at least 6 or 7 years. But I asked, like, for new research, I asked the review board, like, I submitted my protocol, and they told me, because I had one thing, like, if you want me to, it's possible to have the interview by Skype or phone if you want. So they made me add on the letter that it's possible that the Skype interview could be intercepted. So the review board asked me to write this in my contact letter to the researcher. So it's interesting that even the research practice or in evolution. I have a question maybe for you also, is like the basis of your workshop is like you distinguish media activism from tech activism. Well, there's some kind of distinction, but yeah, at some point they are also very united, but in conflict. So, and here it's tech activism is not really present. So yeah, it's not a question actually. I don't know what to ask for a question, but it's just a comment. So Yeah. Like how much, actually the big question is like how tech activism can be considered in itself as a media activism. That's more a conceptual question, but that could bring like strategic issue about how to put together the people and stuff.
In Ottawa, they've set up a not-for-profit internet service provider, which, I mean, under Canadian law, you don't have to hand things over without a court order, but all of the internet service providers just roll over the minute you say boo, except for this independent, not-for-profit service provider who's in their mandate is like, no. So, I mean, there are some options, but I mean, it's very, very small. And it rents the lines off of the big companies, but yeah, so it was an interesting anecdote that might be of some use.
Well, the Autistic inventory, the one I mentioned, by default they do not keep the logs of their users, so they cannot give them up when they are requested to do so. They're actually actively breaking the law, because in Europe we have something called the data retention legislation from 2007. Probably it's going to be reviewed soon, but it's one of these anti-terrorism legislation that forces providers to reveal basically the metadata of all communications, all providers of electronic communication. So they refuse to do so, and so far they have not suffered major consequences from that, but in the past they had actually been, their disks were taken by the FBI. And this was when by mistake, because server space is very expensive, and they run on donations, and they had part of their servers at a private company who didn't hesitate 1 single minute to give everything up. Only to reveal that 2 years later, actually. And not because they had to, but because it came out because it was a court case. But for example, the service that was used by Edward Snowden closed down. The email service, Lavabit, I think it was called. So they closed down because they were being forced to reveal the metadata and I don't know what else, and they decided to get out of the market rather than having to comply. The thing is that, yeah, at least if you have, I mean, it's also a relation of trust, right? So I think this was one of the ideas that I think are behind, I cannot really interpret, but behind the creation of services and groups like Rise Up and Autistic. We are part of the movement, that's what they say. So our skill, our expertise is to provide communication services, but as part of our activism. So we trust you, you trust us. We are all in this together. Then what happens is that, and this was actually discussed at some point, I think in 2008 in one of the People's Global Assemblies, the PGAs, if you remember them. And one of the problems was like, well, this is a space, an infrastructure of the movement. But what happens if some building, some Scottish social centers is evicted? And this was something that was being discussed in Europe. So I don't know how many Scottish social centers there are in North America, but these are taken, reclaimed spaces where people would, do a number of activities and also leave sometimes. And so when a building of this kind is being evicted, then the community, because it's something very visible, very symbolic, the entire community jumps up and tries to help. But when the same happens to a digital infrastructure, where there's not enough awareness, so no one really protests or does anything really. So they just freak out, but that's about it. So that's another problem when it comes to the digital infrastructure of the movements, and probably the movement itself, and I'm saying the movement, like if there was one, but as we know there are several in a variety of ways at different levels, but I'd say for the progressive community. The progressive community, whatever, doesn't have the strength, the resources, certainly has the knowledge, but the resources to engage in creating infrastructure for everyone. And on top of that, they actually don't want to be made very visible, so they're never going to advertise their services. You can find them online if you know that they exist. They occasionally share their skills, and they occasionally go to meetings. But the idea is that the more silent they are, the least they are subject to repression. So that's another problem. I mean, they don't have the resources to engage in sort of widespread education, awareness-raising campaign that might result in people, in fact, migrating to more secure services, or at least services where there is a relation of trust between the service provider and the user. And the result is that everyone else is on Google.
Hello? Anybody else wants to talk? Or? I'm a talker sometimes. One of the way it's brought, this problematic is brought by tech collective and tech activists is something about values, like it's immoral to use Facebook, something like this. And well, that sometimes creates a bit of frustration, or not frustration, but people don't really care about this, and you know, you're kind of hippies not wanting to use Facebook. But the other way, I think that maybe we should turn this on the other way, is like respecting other values. Okay, because right now a lot of stuff is only done in Facebook, which exclude people not on Facebook. So there's kind of exclusion going on. It's not just like using Facebook, it's evil. It's like you're creating like concrete exclusion. So for instance, the Social Forum in Montreal, they are very active on Facebook. They have a website, but sometimes there are information we can only find, like very important information, like call for participation. We can only find it on Facebook. And other times, like there was a survey to know who's going to the farm. It's a Google Docs survey. So many people don't want to use Google Docs. And other time, people will publish a movie in Flash. In Flash, you need to use proprietary software. So there's other software you could use, like just to so that everybody, like you could use, I don't know, maybe MP3. MP3 is proprietary, but at least like there's open source readers for this. So maybe it's a reversal, like media activism is like make sure you are not exclusive in the platform you're using. It's okay, use it on Facebook because Facebook is so cool and brings so much stuff, and so it's the revolution. But try to do it not only in Facebook. So sometimes it might be a good way to talk to people.
Okay, yeah, I mean, for me, one of the issues that comes up time and time again is this like internal and like continual moralizing about what platform's good and what platform's bad. Facebook is like a platform that was designed to track and control people's usage and their connections online. But at the same time, end-to-end encryption is only going to be useful for a certain selection of people who are like smart enough and clued up enough to actually bother researching and finding out about how to use it. There is a sliding scale of just like different activities that can happen on different platforms. And I mean, from my experience, like the use of Facebook can be incredibly helpful if you want to reach out to people who are beyond the kind of insular bubbles of activists that like exist around the world. It means that you can mobilize more people, certainly. But at the same time, on the flip side of that, you're also providing the state and the security services data on how and why your movements are functioning, right? And they can simply, if they, I mean, fortunately we live in a situation where they're not trying to use that data at the moment, but I'm sure they will be in the future. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, sure, okay.
They are, but we're not jailed yet.
Yeah, right, okay. But at the same time, we have to find a way to give people an entry point into our movements. And if that's through Facebook, okay, then for me, I think a really important part of this is actually education and teaching people the skills and the tools that they need to like better their internet security, you know? And like you find it with people who use Facebook for maybe my experiences with the like European border crisis and stuff, and people come to that with kind of like, in quite a naive sense, they just want to help out, you know, and then they suddenly realize that they've got this Facebook profile. They're using it to connect to people who have just arrived in Europe, who also have a Facebook profile. The Facebook and other platforms are extremely useful for people who want to contact their family back home, you know, but that's an innocent kind of communication like network. But as soon as you start as soon as activists start interacting with these networks of people, then you find you have a situation where they are endangering themselves and they're endangering the people that they're trying to help, you know. As soon as this connection is made, you can see that this person is like becoming more militant through their actions. They're like becoming more of a target for the far right and the state. And so they suddenly start to realize that like the Facebook profile that they had with that like smiling picture of them and their full name, it suddenly becomes like, actually you have to think about internet security, you know, you have to think about what you're using and how you're using it, because it is, in effect, it's a tool, you know, and people use tools in different ways. And so I think like it is possible, and it is one way that we can kind of build movements, but unfortunately it's like, it's never going to be the whole solution, you know, like it's only when we come up with something that's going to like actually be able to move past these networks that's, yeah, it's going to be possible to kind of like really see some change in the world. And I think it's really important the kind of the ethics that you've been talking about here, and then like research ethics as well. Like I've been approached by people who are like really interested, or who are part of like research groups that are like buying this data from Facebook about the refugee crisis and about the people and civil society that are like helping refugees and have been mobilized to like provide material support. And they're just buying that like data from Facebook, and they're like, that's the like more liberal end of the research spectrum. The other end is like people who are being given funding by bodies like from like the security services and the state to actually like track people's movements so they can put a stop to these things. Like, and that's a real problem for our like freedom of movement struggles, you know. I'm sorry, that was a bit of a rant, but I've been...
Can I just add two things to this? There was, if you want to look it up, but I have somewhere the link, there was a document that was put up, I think, at the end of 2012 or 2013 by a radical tech collective called Nadir in Germany. I think it's called Let's Talk About Facebook. It was also translated into English. And the idea is that, yeah, this is the most, I mean, they picked on Facebook again, but they are one of the provider groups of alternative tools and web space, and they were trying to drag people's attention to the fact that Facebook is the quintessential repression tool, and that we are putting ourselves into the hands of the state by doing that. And we are also basically bringing in a number of people that might be connected to us that might not even want to, or they don't even share what we think. So it's a very interesting like communique, not very long, which really pins down what the problem is about. Another problem with Facebook, and again, sorry to discuss Facebook extensively, but it's also one of the most studied platforms. I have currently a student of mine who is active in supporting refugees in Europe, and she's doing a thesis on, in a way, sort of the filter bubble, if you want, although there are mixed findings there. But what she's doing, so she has created a fake identity on Facebook, the identity of sort of right-wing, not even extremist, but a right-wing person. And Facebook feeds you what you want to hear, right? So we are tracking over time, so sort of digital ethnography, tracking over time, and not the results yet, but I can see already where it is going, of how Facebook itself contributes to reinforce your ideas, good or bad, right? So there is a level of algorithmic, say, interaction that we do not control. So we don't actually know how Facebook works in full. And, but it does mess up with, for example, our posts and our behavior. And the result is that, I mean, while at the same time being actively invisible, right? I mean, this platform being autonomous in a way, it's not immediately visible to them, the people who have the impression that you can abrogate Facebook and use it for activism. There's a level that we will never be able to appropriate, no matter how much and how smartly we try to trick it. Sorry.
My experience with Facebook is I came into it a lot later, and so I was aware of my internet footprint, and I wanted to, so I used a fake name, and I don't have any pictures of myself at all on Facebook, and I also use a VPN all the time, so I'm flipping my IP address, changing it constantly, and it. But the problem is that I'm putting out all these ideas, but no one knows who I am on Facebook. So it's like delegitimizing my ability to be able to like get activist ideas out there. So it's like if people knew more who I was, they would then trust me more, right? So it's this double-edged sword kind of, where I'm trying to protect myself and trying to protect my other Facebook friends, and yeah, it's tricky. And there has been also like a lot of other Facebook like clones, like was it Diaspora and Elo and a whole bunch that tried to compete with the Facebook market and just totally kind of fell apart. And yeah,
I just had one. It just occurred to me recently. A couple of months ago, I received a Facebook friend request from a person whose image looked familiar. It was a person who was posing as a white male. And then I saw a whole bunch of my Facebook friends had added this person, so that kind of validated for me, oh, I think I must know this person, because look at all of my activist friends, including like very prominent activist academics. They all added this person, so then I did too, but then I looked at their profile, and that's when I got suspicious, because there was almost no content there. It was very bare bones. And I then messaged this person, be like, do we know each other? And there was no response. And then a couple of weeks later, I checked again, and the account was gone. I'm pretty sure it was either police or some kind of state security that was just friending activists to see whoever would friend them back, and then collecting all of the information on their profiles. And there was a news story subsequently about the police in Canada, the security forces in Canada, the secret police doing exactly that. But I'm sure that's not a news story to a lot of you. It's just that it happened to me personally. Pardon?
Not in a very smart way. I mean, like...
Yeah, but I mean, like, we were not smart either. Like, I just looked at all these people who were, like, you know, brilliant academics, but none of them hesitated before adding this person who didn't exist. Like, this person was actually a phantom, and I'm pretty sure that the only reason that happened is because it was police doing it. Also, the G20 incident that I mentioned before was the biggest surveillance operation in Canadian history, so that's kind of informing that previous comment that I made. So watch out, guys, if you ever get a Facebook request from someone you don't like, which we get all the time, but I mean, yeah, be smarter than I was and my friends.
Sometimes it's not always nefarious. I do liaison work with the jailbirdy community with the Ottawa Police, kind of like tackling community-based violence issues. And they were confused about how people were concerned when the diversity race relations branch of the police tried to friend people, and they were like, why don't they want to be our friends? And I'm like, because you're the police. And I had to explain to them how that worked. And so that wasn't for surveillance purposes, it was just community outreach, but they were just so not on that page that I was like, what? Anyway, so it's not always nefarious, sometimes they're just really stupid, so I mean, that's, yeah.
This is being live streamed.
Experiences, maybe perhaps even almost the opposite of Chris's kind of situation, in that my presence is public. I'm like a public figure in the community. I wrote for the newspaper. My ideas, my face and name is in the paper. So things that I do, I try to make them public, to provide a security for myself. Because if anything were to happen to me, people would know about it. Whereas if something were to happen to Chris, his identity is anonymous, and nobody would know what happened to him. And so, in organizing in Toronto with Occupy Gardens Toronto Collective, we're a collective of guerrilla gardeners, and we wanted to make the gardens known to the public. And so our communications were all transparent online, and our meetings were held in public, and we were planning a garden planting at Queen's Park, which is our provincial legislature. And I get a private email message from Constable Sharma. He's a legislative security officer, informing us that our planned garden party is unpermitted, and they'd like to have a meeting with us, and because we're rehearsing on the front lawn, and they see our event on Facebook, and they know when it is and who's coming and everything, and so we meet with them, and we go forward with our action anyways. But their presence, it was a kind of a game of political theater we were playing, because we wanted them there, because we wanted that image of community people, like young people, kids, seniors, elders, gardening with heavy police presence, and so they kind of played into it. And so when they came, and you see all these like police officers, and you have this very peaceful event of kids gardening and people sharing food and all these things, and the media's there. The second time we did the action, the police, they told us that they spoke with the mainstream media to suppress further coverage of the event. Because they had eventually clued into our tactics that we wanted them there, and we wanted them to destroy the garden to demonstrate, that violence that's inherent in the system, because a free food garden in a high-profile public space that is a precedent they can't allow to happen, because then people are going to be planting free food gardens everywhere, and it'd be anarchy, and the whole system would fall apart. That's what the RCMP said, at least.
By the way, I had in mind actually to start the workshop asking, going around and asking everyone to introduce themselves and what sort of platforms are we in. And I forgot, sorry. So we can do it now if you want.
Hi. I'm not a media maker or media producer myself, but I work in distribution exhibition of political documentary. And we have a network of exhibition sites throughout the country, and we work with not just artists and independent filmmakers, but activists from all shades of the left spectrum. So, there has been a constant debate in the organization. What are the best ways to use sort of those mainstream corporate platforms, and how we could most strategically use them. We've started a very concerted effort at moving away from those platforms, including like file sharing, services like Dropbox and Google Gmail, and of course emails. We have our own server right now, which is hosted by a fabulous anarchist collective in Montreal called Kumbit, and this has really been a recurring conversation. So I just wanted to because clearly there is ways in which Facebook could be used to further our mission, reaching into the mainstream, what people are talking about, spreading the message beyond the choir and whatnot. But again, the main question remains: how do we not only protect ourselves and the work we do, but how do we protect the activists and people and communities on the front lines? So that we are constantly in communication with, not just in terms of, interviews, but just strategizing together around different events, communicating people's, travel agendas and plans, and which ties to, of course, tracking their locations around the world and in the country and whatnot. So I just wanted to just put it out there again, are there organizations, do you personally have try to figure out a basic code of conduct, or maybe like a protocol or a list of guidelines around that? How do you navigate those spaces without putting anyone at risk?
I guess it's a good example that things are actually possible. and they do not require that much that much expertise at the end of the day. I mean, like using, for example, on cloud, which it's not different from Dropbox at the end of the day. So there are many others. I mean, it's true, like PGP encryption, for example, encrypting your email requires a little bit of attention, at least at the beginning, and it's probably the extra step that many people might not be ready to take. But then again, if someone does, then you can share and expand the concern and the passion for these things. But I think the guidelines and things like this are quite important. In my organization, we are not an organization, we are a research collective. We are taking it very seriously. In part, actually, and this is a point that was made earlier, the research board and the founders who drove that effort, well, it all started with my argument that activists are vulnerable subjects. And so if we study activists, we ought to take it very, very seriously. And, but also, for example, now we have taken on board as part of our research group someone who is, a would-be political refugee for surveillance-related case. So it also becomes very important also to protect our own research collective from observation. So we're working on actually an ethical working paper that I'm very, very happy to share that details, for example, how do we deal with data at different phases of the circle, so data collection, analysis, storage, and all of that. But also how we communicate with each other. I have to say that not entire collective is actually using PGP encryption. And as I mentioned, the university email that to some extent we still use is hosted by Microsoft. But everything else in our organization is hosted by either a very nice, eco-friendly, security-minded organization, not far from where we are, and we have our own servers. So we try to do things according to, like some certain guidelines that we gave us ourselves. Spending money sometimes, because it meant that if you want your own cloud distribution, you have to spend something. If you want to use, for example, we wanted to have password-protected etherpads, rise up as very nice etherpads, but they can be, so if there is a link there, then it might be retrieved through Google. So let's say if we are doing something which is supposed to be secret. Although, we are a research collective, we don't plan revolutions, not yet, but still there might be sensitive information, for example, concerning people we interview. So we decided to go for encrypted etherpads, and we had to pay the service. But it's in the order of 800 euros for the time being, so for the future till we need the services. So it's not unaffordable. So we're using a number of different services. We have own cloud for shared calendar and for all the storage. We have the email and mailing lists that are hosted by a eco-friendly and security-minded server that costs more than, we could use the university stuff, right, free. But we decided to go self-organized. And then we are also using etherpads, so collaboration, like wikis, collaboration platforms for online text production, for example, like a Google Doc, which are password protected and friendly, activist friendly. And it was complicated, in the sense that we are now 8 months into the project, and we spent the first 5 months discussing what we wanted and getting everyone up to speed, and still not everyone is using encryption. But it was part of also our remit as what we study. If you study what we call data activism and the politics of big data and massive data collection, it would be a bit of a contradiction to do otherwise, basically. But yeah, it is possible, and I think for research organizations, I think it becomes particularly useful to share these guidelines and conducts. Not everyone has the skills. We happen to have a very good security researcher as part of our team, so she helped us. So we're very happy to share what we have learned, for example. But then you also have non-research organizations that do that. And so it's really doable. I don't know how many of you have ever attended a crypto party. A crypto party? Yeah. So crypto parties are parties. I mean, like they're basically gatherings, more or less party-like, where people teach encryption, or anyway, help people to transition to more secure communications. So you bring your laptop, and then someone who is a little more skilled walks you through installation of this, and that. And it's pretty interesting. I've been to a number of them, in particular in the UK, and there were people who didn't know anything. But people like, the classical, sorry for the example, which is also a bit non-feminist, but like the classic housewife who comes and doesn't, she just, I've heard this nodding thing. What can I do? And this is fantastic, and it's really empowering, because it's actually the change that we want to see in the world, right, beyond our activist circles. And it's something that, has the potential to escalate also to the rest of the community and so on and so forth. So there are efforts at trying to share and bridge the gap between desires and knowledge and practice and expertise. But it requires, first and foremost, a critical approach, and that's really is the point of the workshop. For me, it was, frankly, a little bit shocking, but from probably the generation I come from, and here I feel very old, but also yeah, but it's true. and also the ideological background I come from, to hear that people are just using these tools for activism without asking any question. I'm in no way say don't use the tools, because the tools are, if people are out there, yeah, well, whatever, that's where we have to be as well. But then I think also our role should be at least partially an attempt to educate people also in that respect, especially if we sort of ascribe ourselves to the category of media activism, which, at least the way I've always seen it, is like someone who has a little bit more skill when it comes to media production than others, and therefore can, perform that role within a movement. So it's, for me, it's just a little, it's an imperative in a way to take into account values like do not harm and take, the hands-on approach. That doesn't necessarily mean learn to program, although it's fun, but means maybe just ask yourself questions and, assess the needs and the tools on the basis of also some basic notion like Facebook is not free. I mean, for example, there's a lot of concern also in this group. I mean, I've heard it popping up in several occasions these days for unpaid labor. But I mean, as Facebook users, myself as well, we are all unpaid workers in a way, right? Because we contribute our data and our social graph to. I mean, so it's an economic capitalist business model, which has, our own free, willing participation to this at its core. So it would be good to think that, to at least get rid of the illusions that we can really trick these platforms, that we can bend them to our needs, because it's not true, at least only partially true. And I really much like the idea of changing the narrative, because of course, yeah, the idea of moralizing, of this is wrong, and I'm the first who does that, and I really don't like it. But it's disempowering, and it's top-down, and it doesn't probably point to really the real problem, which is not a problem of morality, but it's more like a problem, although I pointed to hacker ethics, which is about morality, but it's really a matter of inclusion and protecting the communities we work with and for. So changing narratives there, I think, is also probably a good idea. I don't know whether there are further points we want. Sorry.
Whoa.
This is tech activism, media activism.
Yeah. Do you think like a rise up should be in this conference?
Yeah.
For instance, like are they media activists or?
Yeah. I mean, it depends how you define it. I wrote once a piece on hacktivism as a radical media practice. So in the sense that I think there's actually a continuity between whatever use of media, like between different uses of media. It is true that we all come from different ideological backgrounds, right? And people might have got to activism through different lens. Like probably a lot of the people here come from community activism, and then they got into media as a sort of extension of that. Whereas many of these people that I was talking about come the other way around. And of course, I'm generalizing, so I'm just, it's a rough distinction. But in my opinion, yes, there is a continuity, and yes, we should all come together. And that's also the reason why I proposed this Skillsshare. Like, we should talk a little more. They have a lot to learn from, I say, us, in terms of, for example, the focus on the community, which sometimes they forget, and many other things. And likewise, we have a lot to learn from them in terms of approaching the platforms we use critically. And maybe they tend to be a little, tragic and really gloomy when you listen to them. But there's value actually in their message.
There's difficulties I face, like with the Free Media Forum, because we try to get the tech activism and the media activism, tech activists, media activists, hackers, and community radio all together. But we have a problem like how to frame just the call for participation, because sometimes we send it to some mailing list and people say, what's that stuff about open source and hackers, and that's not for like community media. And then we send it to hackers and they say, well, that's too much media and our stuff is not about. So it's not simple, and here there's no much like open source, hacker and stuff like this. There's you. And
well, there's more. There's you. There's her.
Yeah, but there's individual. But in terms of presentation,
yeah,
there's not that much. For instance, we could have a workshop of encryption here, but there's no workshop of encryption. So there's like, how do you manage to get people together? It's more a question, maybe.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Probably we can spend some time discussing that, because it's a big challenge.
I mean, I guess as one of the conference organizers, we certainly wanted more tech workshops and Skillshares, and maybe it's our fault for not knowing where to find some of these collectives, because we have more contacts with media activists. I don't know if we're as equally well connected, or if we're not looking in the right places, not doing outreach in the right places. I know there must be some overlap between these two communities, certainly, and Stefan, like, you're one person who straddles both worlds, and I'm sure other people in the room do too, but I know tons of media activists. I don't know very many tech activists.
I'm not criticizing here. It's more an open question.
Yeah.
Do people have an answer?
I guess it's a big challenge. I mean, there are two different worlds in a way. I mean, for me, it was refreshing to come to this conference, because I've been going to a lot of digital rights, digital freedoms, internet freedoms conferences. There are different crowds, there are different ways of working very often. I wrote a book on the connection between the two, but it was a totally artificial connection. You know, when you do a PhD, you have to somehow show that there is something that you're the only one to see. And I call it emancipatory communication practices. And the idea was to see how people mobilize around technologies. Because I do believe, I'm a little bit of a techno-determinist, and I do believe that technology shapes social practices. I also believe that we shape technology, but in a way, I think there is value in highlighting also that technology shapes social practices and identities as well. So I compare radios and radical techies, radio practitioners. From that data collection, it was about, I think about 100 in the end interviews in between the two groups. I found a few instances, really like a handful, of people that were in between. So the techie guy would occasionally also program a radio platform upon request. Or the guy that really found radio super exciting, so he was also doing that. Or the internet cafe. So basically the squats in the Netherlands, they were operating this sort of, in the 90s, this internet cafes, things where people could go when you had no internet at home, were also operating a pirate radio station. So there were these instances. There was a guy from Tanzania that was a radio maker who learned to program. And he learned to program because he realized that the platforms the tools that he needed were not available where he was living. Or there were, for example, he needed Linux installations because Microsoft products, they would come, they didn't have the money to buy all the updates and stuff like that. So in order to maintain the machine, he learned out of necessity. So I guess these are special points of connection, although it was more on the need basis, and there was not like a connection between articulating two worlds and two movements, if you want to call them that way, that are able to talk to each other. I guess probably a way of mobilizing techies is to say, you need them. So kind of involving them as we need your skills, so please come and share. Of course, they suffer a little bit from being the service providers in a way in which often whatever other movement media suffers, like radios but also print media, like the idea that you're only the sort of loudspeaker and you're never enough part. I mean, you're considered like an addendum sometimes. So they also suffer from that. So maybe it has to be, pitched in a way that shows connections, added value on both sides. Not just we need to learn encryption, so please come, but we can also all fight surveillance together. I mean, surveillance is a widespread and repression concern for all social movements. And there are different ways of fighting it. More, for example, content-wise, education, awareness raising, which is something, for example, that community radio can do. And the more kind of encryption, shielding yourself off like a techie would do.
Just wanted to comment on that question, too, on how to connect the media and tech activism. Earlier, as in your introduction, you kind of laid out some demographic differences between the two groups, and I wonder maybe there's more to explore there, and the demographic differences and how the techies are more kind of white men with access to greater resources, or like in terms of, I don't know if that's true, but in my experience, like the people that I know who are very involved in the tech aspects are more on their own, kind of like working in isolation. And whereas people doing more community media activism are more, out there in the community and
and very often
and
what
not
happens
working
is
on technology, but more working with people, social.
There is
sorry,
very often the fact that they are male and white and experts results in actually pretty strong patriarchal approaches, which are not very nice. The result is that there are several groups, there were at least in the past, I don't know how many of them are still active, that there were women-only collectives. And the idea was really to create not a women-only as a goal, as an end, but as a sort of interim protected space, nurturing space in which you could learn without being told off. At the same time, I also have plenty of evidence of the few women that I interviewed that were worse than the men in their patriarchal attitude. So,
I just wanted to comment that outside of the major urban radio stations, and there's maybe 20 or 30 of them, the other 170 odd radio stations are all run by white men called Jeff. Like that's a standard. You laugh, but there has been at the Ontario Broadcasting Association. There was a panel of experts, and there were 5 of them, and they were all white men called Jeff. So no, I'm not joking. That's why I mention it, because it's weirdly true. So yeah, no, it's in the radio sector as well. And you mentioned about women collectives in tech in those groups, and it's like, we see the same things in community radio, the women's organizations to create radio outside of a very male-dominated industry, because there is incredible comparisons between the two.
Yeah, unfortunately, I guess technology is it's often associated with maleness. But at the same time, I don't think that the tech, I don't remember what it was called, at some point they made like a Barbie, the nerdy Barbie or something, with glasses and a computer is actually the solution to the problem. But
there's two things I wanted to point out. First, I think it's possible to have common struggles around certain policies, especially surveillance, you mentioned it. But there's also network neutrality, so which is something like media activism might not master very much. But who knows about network neutrality here? Who doesn't know? you know? Okay. But network neutrality is the idea, like all bits are created equal, but like you said, which is a bit funny. But basically it's that companies, they cannot discriminate traffic based on the content or the origin, okay? Except if it's a state directive, but that's another thing. But for instance, in 2005, one of the big cases of net neutrality in Canada is like TELUS, they blocked the website. They were hosting the website of one of their union, okay? So they blocked the traffic to the union because they, the union was in strike or there was a working conflict. So it didn't last very much, but at some point they could be like, the companies could have like, well, that's the political part, but there's a marketing part in which, like, for instance, the phone company could give you have a reduced price for your 3G access only if you access Facebook or some other stuff. So let's say you have a website, an alternative media on a website, then you would not have access with your phone if we don't have a law like protecting network neutrality. So it's really, I think it's really important for alternative media. And also there's one organization, there's one organization in Canada, it's called Open Media. And it's an organization, it's a tech organization, like tech policy organization, but it's funny, it's called Open Media, but they are doing tech. So anyway, I see a bridge here. The other thing is I want to say is like, we should be aware also, because activism, it's closely related to like tech activists. When we talk about tech, it's closely related to open source and hackers and stuff like this. But open source activists and hackers are not all progressists.
No.
There are a big bunch of them that are libertarian and sometimes very disgustingly libertarian. But there's like fluidity between these people. Like myself, I'm part of a group, open source lobby group in Montreal, and in it there's also libertarians. And what I'm saying is like sometimes the progressive organization, they want to do like doing good tech, so they go to open source people, and then but the open source people they have this discourse, let's do open source for social justice, but they don't have any idea of the like broader political, and they just sometimes sometimes they are just youth using open source and they say bring social justice, or they are libertarian and they say so there's like a lot of ideological confusion about this, and it's not because you work with open source or with hackers that you necessarily work with your friends.
Yeah.
So it's very important to distinguish this at some point.
No, it's a very good point that you raise. I mean, it's not necessarily a kind of natural match, or not with the entire spectrum. But another thing that I think is your TELUS example, blocking the union website, it's really the quintessential reason why we should really care about where do we put our content and our infrastructure. Whom do we trust in that respect? I think it's key. But yeah, I'm probably trying to find some common struggles. I mean, there were attempts, as I mentioned, there was the PGA that tried to bridge between, actually it was between squatters and radical techies. So it was not between media activists and techies. But to my knowledge, it wasn't particularly successful. I mean, it stopped there. There were a couple of convergences more, but then didn't go very far. So there's definitely work to do. But because it has to start from someone and somewhere, and Snowden has taught us a lesson that we should care about as media activists, then maybe we can be the ones who try to bridge over. And the Montreal Forum in August can be one of the occasions in which, at the end of the day, it's all, I mean, friendship comes from collaboration, right? So if you put a bunch of people in the same space. I guess the difficulty is convincing them to come together, but there's value, I personally believe.
As you were talking, I was thinking that how can we connect radio to this topic of net neutrality? And then I remembered that there was one of the internet service providers had throttled movie streaming on their cell phones. Like they dialed it right down. Well, in Canada, 22% of Canadians stream a radio station. So we can convince radio stations that their online access to the online communities is being potentially throttled. So perhaps that's the point of collaboration. That's how we rope in Jeff with his radio station in rural BC to be concerned about this topic. Is that, you know, their access to their online community could be limited as a result of this. So there is certainly, if you speak the language of Jeff, then there's certainly a potential there to create those connections. So,
There was some interesting coming in the last year with the Bill C-51 here in Canada, the anti-terror bill. The government put in all kinds of legislation to enable surveillance, increased surveillance powers, and there were some really interesting kind of coalitions that were formed from these libertarian groups that are very much pro-privacy, and then these other groups that are very much anti-state, and them coming together in a very a very interesting way. Yeah, it's like some of the rallies, you know, we had, and the kinds of people that were showing up there, there's very interesting constellations of people that I hadn't seen together before in the same kinds of spaces.
Yeah, I think the threat coming from state, corporation, or whoever else is always a good way of making people converge, unfortunately. And in that respect, I mean, like, there's another revelation should have, you know, been really big wake-up call, but they were only to some extent. I don't know how much they were discussed here in Canada, for example. In my own country, they were not at all. So there are different, the perception of threat also varies, and we cannot count on that, although there's always a threat coming out around the corner. But any other thought, or? Because otherwise what I can do is show you a list. I mean, this workshop, the idea was not to have some practical outcome. It was more like, you know, collective thinking exercise, exchanging practices, and forcing ourselves to reflect on a number of threats and opportunities as they affect our daily activity as activists, researcher, or I mean, individuals that act in a society, as friends and family they want to stay connected with. But probably one thing that can be done is, well, I can summarize these points if you guys like the idea, and also add a couple of resources, like this very nice call for action to get out of Facebook by this German collective called Nadir. And we can maybe circulate them a list amongst the people who came here. Because the idea is, again, not to be disempowering, not to moralize people's behavior, but to help the entire community to think about certain issues which end up affecting us all, and also beyond our circle of people who, in a way or another, have some media skills. So if you like the idea, I can also do that with the organizers. It's going to be just a summary, so we can also maybe collect the email of everyone so that I can share with you just a list. It's a very low-cost type of engagement. You all have to install PGP, otherwise I'm not going to talk to you. No, don't worry. No, I'm not that pure, unfortunately. I'm terrible with myself. Yeah, if maybe people want to do that, so that I make sure that the points that are there, which are a little bit roughly. Exactly. So assuming that as we are living in a surveillance society, what are, some technologies of resistance, that we can use? Now, as I mentioned earlier, technology of resistance is a bit of a over-positive frame in the sense that most of them come anywhere from companies. They're not necessarily grassroots projects. There's not much resistance and shrin in the vision. But, well, it's a way of thinking about that is empowering, at least. By the way, the picture that you see there comes from, it was actually a gigantic screen with a number of screens all over the sides, the clear ones. Just a picture taken with a phone of the opening session of the biggest, probably the biggest hacker conference in the world called, was the Chaos Communication Congress. It's every year in Germany at the end of the year. It's for New Year's Eve. And this was, I think, not the last one, but probably 3 years ago. And it was after Snowden, and it started with this projection. That was an opening video. And usually this conference has a theme, and that year there was no theme because they said the Snowden revelation has left us speechless. But it's interesting, like for us academic, for example, this is a side comment. In this conference there were 9,000 hackers, and the session was always so super well attended. Like here there were like probably 5,000 to 6,000 people attending this. So there are many, and they're not all very nice, but some of them we can leverage. Here there are some alternatives, and we can, if you want, walk through them. I don't know. I have the impression that the expertise in this room is quite high anyway, but maybe there's something that you're not familiar with. So if you want, I can tell you more or less what they are. So for secure email accounts, secure again a little bit between brackets, right? But for at least email accounts services that share our values, I put just the most famous activist ones, but there are many. There's, for example, the one that was mentioned earlier, I think in Montreal. And there are many others. But Rise Up and Autistici are probably the most popular. Just to give you an idea, Autistici, I don't know whether it is still like that, but basically it is also in English. They offer many other services anyway. But you had to explain them why you wanted the service. And the idea is that by offering your service, they create a community. So it's not just, with Google, you open it in 3 minutes. With this guy, maybe it takes 3 days because, they are volunteers. But it's worth it, I think. Encryption, PGP, so pretty good privacy or open PGP that I put there. It's not that difficult to install after all. If someone wants to do that, I'm around tomorrow morning, and I can walk you through if I still remember how to do it. But it is basically a piece of software that you install in your computer. It's a system that connects. So, by the way, you can also use it to encrypt disks or partitions of disks, hard disks. And it has a system of keys that authenticates the other person you are talking to. Blogging platforms, again, there are many others. That's why there are these 3 dots in many of these. I just put my favorite. And, well, this blue is really not a good idea, but it's blogging platforms over there. Noblogs.org, which is a service offered by Autistici. My soccer team has a website there, meaning it doesn't have to be political content to be there. You need to be non-sexist, non-racist, and non-fascist, but this probably we can do. Social networks for organizing. Well, they're not all for organizing, but Crabgrass was created by Rise Up for organizing. So the idea is not just to share pictures with your friends, but it's to facilitate self-organization by groups, and it works quite well. I've not been using it recently, but when I was using it, it was quite good. Etherpad, so platforms for collaborative text production. It is. It might be retrieved by Google, as I said, so not password protected, but this is https://pad@riseup.net. Sorry, pad.riseup.net. Storage on cloud. Again, it's one of the several that exist, but it works fine. I mean, depends on what you want. You have to pay for it, but it's worth it. And it works exactly like Dropbox. Scheduling, instead of Doodle, you have Doodle, which was developed. There are the links there on the next slide, but it was developed by, so it's an open source. It works exactly the same, except it doesn't have a very funky interface. But it is possible to use it. It's not like, super cumbersome. It just doesn't look very good. It was developed by a German university. For instant messaging, for your phone, there's plenty of stuff, and for your computer as well. So some are computers, some are phones, so like Signal, Telegram, just secure. WhatsApp now is also encrypted, but it's owned by Facebook, or Google, Facebook, I think. Yeah. So, they implemented end-to-end encryption, which is good. It's probably, in response to several concerns. But, and you might have noticed it on your phone that there was this pop-up that said this communication is now encrypted, blah, blah. But Signal is not owned by Facebook. So I prefer it to WhatsApp. And it works exactly in the same way. It's just downloading an application. So I also forced my mother to do that. And I use both because there are people that, certain groups that you cannot migrate entirely, right? But like for the internal communication of my research group, we use Signal. Telegram is something similar. Telegram is actually more functionalities. I wrote them down because I never remembered them because I don't quite use it. But you can also have, you can time your messages so they can destroy themselves, self-destroy after a certain amount of time. But it's more or less the same. Jabber is probably the one which is the most complicated to set up because you need a little bit of skills and patience. But it's basically an equivalent to, I use it as a sort of alternative to Facebook chat. Sorry, Facebook chat, to Skype chat. For calls, Jitsi. It works very nicely. It's not particularly complicated. Blocking, this is now a bit of a soup of things. So blocking of trackers, so they make cookies visible and you can decide to get rid of them or deactivate them. There's disconnect, better privacy, ghostery. There are several, so just some. They're all developed by companies, private companies. But some of them, I think disconnect, for example, the basic version is actually free. So you can use it free of charge. For secure browsing, I put together a number of different things, a little bit about because there was not much space in the slide. I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but there are different things. So the VPN, the virtual private network, you can use it to connect, for example, to your university, and to go through, channel your traffic to the university servers, for example. But we heard Chris saying that he uses regularly, so probably you don't use the university one. There are several services of that kind. Tor is a little, it's great, but it's also a little annoying because it actually slows down your communication. So this is probably the one that interjects a little bit our usual practices. And it is a software and an open network that basically allows you to browse the internet anonymously by building a number of layers in between you and, for example, the website you want to visit or the email, the receiver of the email that you want to send. If you have a website, it costs a little bit of money, but implement HTTPS. Sorry. Oh yeah, thank you. Thank you. No, it was just I did it today, but if you want to add something on that. I knew there was something I had forgotten.
So guys, as you know, I'm a technician. I deal with IT primarily. I've learned a lot about media activism and how you guys have to get stuff out right now. But like you've already pointed, network neutrality is huge. Bill C-51 is huge. We've got all these corporate entities that play with our internet access. Sorry. So I think that it's important to talk about security. Your HTTPS can be free now. Sorry.
I'll pay for it.
But I think it's important to talk about this because I think from the IT perspective, we know what's broken. The media activists, I think you guys know what's broken, but I don't think the general public understands. we've got we've got a lot of these ISPs that are filtering, and then you've got these black box places they're building in the desert that are intercepting all your transoceanic internet access. They are actually able to grab all of the communications. If I showed you how easy it is to grab a VoIP call and play it back, you'd all be afraid to use the internet. These days we've moved to converged networks where your data, your communication, your voice traffic, everything is on the same wire now. And it's very easy to intercept. And if you're not using the security, it's definitely a big thing. So I'm trying to kind of articulate my thoughts here. So yeah, anyways, there's a group called Let's Encrypt, and they're now giving away free SSL certificates. They're not totally infallible, but it's a good start. It puts things out of reach. Even here at the university, we've got weird setups with our Wi-Fi because we don't have a valid SSL certificate, and it causes extra trouble. You know, we've got VPN servers here that we can control, but we've got other entities out there that are controlling it as well. I run my own VPN for all sorts of reasons. It's on a secure server that I own. I own the IP addresses. They're not in other people's ranges, and now Netflix even knows. You know, so they're now actually blocking data center ranges and IPs. So if you guys are rolling your own, and I kind of get that's what you're talking about here. You run your own software. But if it's not secure, if it's not set up reliably, and if the upstream providers don't have end-to-end communication encryption, then, you know, it's all out there anyways. So I think, really, I think to sum it up is just awareness. We need to make a big roar from the IT community, from the activist community, and just better educate the general public. Sorry, I'm out of breath after the jump.
Yeah, I think this puts things nicely into perspective. I was afraid of being gloomy, but we have reached a new level.
Sorry.
No, but it puts things into perspective, right? I mean, it's. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's why, I mean, it's also important as a community of activists and progressive people to support the individuals that do the extra step and actually put their life at risk in a way or another to bring a message to us or to develop something that then is falls under the attention of the authorities who don't like it in particular.
Can I ask a question related to that?
Yeah.
The second name on your shirt,
Let's talk about that later. Yeah.
Secure browsing, in comparison to private browsing on Firefox, for example,
I can point you to unless our IT guy knows, I can point you to resources that elaborate on that, although probably they're in a language that you don't understand. But I'm not good enough now to tell you exactly the difference. Yeah, I think it's on now.
Private browsing is just like if somebody catch your computer, they won't know what you're browsing. But if nobody could catch the conversation. So for instance, if you're using a private, other people wants to answer, or I don't know, but let's say you're using private browser here in the classroom. If we go on your computer, in theory, we won't see what you're browsing, but the tech people who are in charge of the connection, they will see it. They can see it. Okay. So they can look at the different websites. So if you're using Tor or VPN, they won't be able to see it. So basically, private browsing is just like client technology, and the other one is like it's securing like the whole network connection.
So we have an answer. Okay. Then there's two references to one of very general Linux. And one is, this is a community-run version of distribution of Android that I personally never used, but try it out. I don't have a machine that allows me to use. This is bookmarking, not dockmarking. And it is normally actually bibliographical, it's for academic references, but you can also use it to share links. Might not look as beautiful as other bookmarking services, but it is actually very efficient and very nicely organized. So this is just a sort of growing list that I just developed off the top of my mind, forgetting off probably of the things, but of alternatives that one can educate himself and the group is part of to use. Yeah, there are some of the URLs that for the services I mentioned there, and we're actually running out of time. But given we started talking research, I would like to bring it to a close, like going back to research, and just offering something which is a piece of work which is an evolution. There's probably a lot of room for criticism and improvement. It's my making sense of how also the ethics of research when we research social movement, communities, and social change activities. And so it's for doing research that matters, but also that at the same time does not harm the communities that we work with. This is one version that I have, but I have a probably better version that, however, I couldn't find in my computer. And it is basically, so this is a sort of checklist for research on social movement and activism. Research that is, as I said, does not harm and tries to answer questions that also the movements care about. So theory development may be yes, but also in function of social change, not as an end in itself. So there are, the table summarizes like 4 questions or challenges. So the question of relevance, risk of power, and of accountability that the researcher should ask when going to the field. It is linked to different phases of the research project that it pertains to, where it should be asked in a way. So when you develop a research question, when you engage data collection, when you engage in theory building or data analysis, so on and so forth. And then the approach, some of the solution or potential solutions to this question. The question of relevance tries to address the artificial divide that exists between movements and academia. So between the study and practice of social change. And for example, one of it's actually, I don't know, the table is a little funny because reflexivity should be at the bottom next to research with, but anyway, never mind. You got a point. So one of the ways of answering the question of relevance is deciding between, for example, doing research with versus doing research about. But also, how do you plan? What's the time frame of your research? So if we are to implement cycles of dialogue, and if you are to take, for example, movements as skilled learners, and this is not this is from Charlotte Ryan, an excellent urban sociologist. So she suggests to take movements for what they are, producers of knowledge and narratives, and not just as entities that we're trying to get information from. And so if you have to involve them as skilled learners, we should sort of plan for recursive cycles of dialogue. So getting something, bringing something back, and building a sort of spiral. So we need a different time frame for research, for example. And then in continuous, there's the issue of risk, in which I inserted both the issue of cyber security, cyber surveillance and privacy, or line communication, but also more general, the issue of surveillance repression, which didn't come, unfortunately, with digital services. Power, so the clash of organizational cultures between academia, which is individualistic and competitive, versus the activist culture that is usually, or would like to be, collaborative and conducive to change rather than to immediate again. And then the issue of accountability. How do we bring back to the movement, but how we're also embedding accountability into the relationship, because at the end of the day, we are responsible for what we do. Remember that do not harm. But also because whatever we do, if we do it wrong, it's going to harm other researchers as well, not just the movement. Meaning that I've had actually cases of people that didn't want to talk to me on the ground, that some other researchers had gone there just stalling something, at least this was the perception, giving nothing back. So, for example, taking the idea of that activism is labor as well, not just academic research is labor. It's a good first step to having a different relation. In any case, I mean, I have more resources of this kind. It's a work in progress. And now the last piece that we wrote on this actually spoke about the STRAP framework. And he elaborated on this, I don't remember what S was for, but basically relevance, risk, power, accountability in sort of development key. But yeah, I guess we're running out of time. We are getting into the invading the time of the coffee break, I think, right?
Yeah. Next session starts at 4. So yeah.
Exactly. So if you want to stretch your legs before the next session. But thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. And hopefully we'll find ways to feed back what we discussed here to the rest of the people who are here. Again, not to try to moralize or teach anything, but as a sort of occasion of collective reflection of risks and benefits.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.